Well, great to be with you.
Well, it's great to be with
Thank
you,
you.
Senator Young.
Hard to follow that.
Well,
Yeah.
You've done some amazing things with the CHIPS and Science Act. You know, I was just telling a little bit of story in government when we all got together in October 2019 with the Endless Frontier Act. And we went over to Senator Schumer's office. He kicked that thing off. And the analogy I always use is the CHIPS and Science Act. It's like an Apollo program, right? It's going to have incredible impact on our country for a long time. So what were some of the things you were thinking about, back then when we first presented the Endless Frontiers Act and all these national security sectors, funding them in R&D? And also, maybe also talk about one of the big issues that we were concerned about of, China stealing the intellectual property and safeguards. So what are some of the things we should be doing in that area?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Keith, for having me. Thank you for your beneficence, for helping to create this center and for your leadership. And let me just say, for starters, that this thing we're calling the CHIPS and Science Act, it's a legislative initiative that you have a lot of ownership in. Keith exercised, he was walking point on thought leadership in the State Department last administration on this sort of portfolio of issues. Tech diplomacy, dealing with the geopolitical sort of weaponization of markets and supply chains, technology and technology investment in this country, and trying to make sure that the United States of America continues to lead the way in developing next generation technologies. So thanks for the counsel you've given to me. Some of the things we discussed, I recall in those early days, Keith, were you start with the U.S.-China competition and look at the different vectors of it, recognize the sort of fight you're in. It's a fight short of low-intensity conflict. It's a fight short of threats of conflict most days. It's being fought in the commercial realm, in the psychological realm. It's being fought diplomatically, and so you and I would discuss the need to invest more in research. We developed the Endless Frontier Act. Yep. That doubled down, tripled down on our research occurring through our universities, occurring through our DOE labs in areas of applied research, something that historically had tapered off since the space race. We didn't learn from our own economic history, recognizing that even as conservatives, as I am, you need to continue to invest in that infrastructure that pays dividends for the economy as research does. We also needed to recognize that there occasionally are keystone technologies that just can't be replicated, at least in the short order, and semiconductors are those. So that if you don't have access to a sufficient number of sort of like commodity level semiconductors, you're going to have idle supply chains at your auto factories, as we did over the course of the pandemic.
Yeah.
You certainly need to have the higher end semiconductors because we're dependent on those for our weapons system. So we talked about those vulnerabilities, Keith, and the CHIPS and Science Act was an effort to at once invest in a whole gamut of next-gen technologies through research and then commercialization of that research, and also to deal with that near-term vulnerability in our supply chains.
Right.
Yeah.
I was telling this group before you arrived about the global economic security strategy.
Yes.
And, a big part of that idea was during my confirmation process. I would study folks who've done it before because I really didn't know anything about government. And I remember you asking questions. Hey, can you give us a strategic plan and all that? And, in the private sector where I come from, you do not operate without a strategic plan. And you actually tried to sponsor a bill.
Yes.
That would institutionalize that. And as you remember, there were three pillars. I call it offense, defense, and force multipliers. The offense was turbocharge economic competitiveness and innovation. The second was safeguard America's assets. The third one is form a network of trusted partnerships. And, you know, if I think about this whole business of onshoring TSMC, this came out of this initiative, right? They were the most important foreign company in the United States national security. And what was interesting is when we popped our heads up in early 2020, we looked around. There was not one semiconductor company in the world that was going to build anything in the United States.
Yes.
And we were talking to CEO of Intel, Samsung, Micron. None of them. We figured if we get TSMC, that would be a good catalyst.
Now we've unlocked $300 billion in counting
$300
of private
billion
capital
since that onshoring. Yeah. And I mean, that was a remarkable thing. Tell us, in terms of implementing that,
yes.
I think, you know, the proof is in the pudding where you see the private sector match. 5x, right?
Yes.
Of the money allocated. In terms of implementing with the different companies, just kind of give us a state of the state. How's all that going? And what do you see as the future? And can we apply this to the other technologies?
So I will. Let me first say, and this is the best place to start, where you started, the global economic security strategy. I thought, what you thought, I think this idea was germinating in both of our brains at roughly the same time. We have a president who recognizes that when countries are tariffing you, sometimes you apply tariffs, fully aware of comparative advantage, but geopolitically, you apply sort of reciprocal tariffs. So I think we had that policy basically right. Then there are other areas of government intervention in the economy that make geopolitical sense. They're not always in furtherance of efficiency. So another example would be co-production. We need to co-produce certain articles knowing that in the future it's an insurance policy against there being shortages of those articles. Then semiconductors, you know, a keystone technology, a core technology that is identified and critical to, foundational to just about everything with an on-off switch these days. Export controls, you know, what is the appropriate scope of export controls on particular article. So there's critical thinking that has to be brought to each of these things, but never was I finding this thinking documented anywhere.
Right.
And so as though we were shooting from the hip, and what I thought we needed was something analogous to our national security strategy. It's on the paper. From administration to administration, it changes somewhat, and that's documented. And then everyone within the administration and around the world, frankly, understands what our foreign policy is. We did not have that.
Right.
And we still don't have it.
In the military, right? You have your defense.
It's doctrine.
It's doctrine.
It evolves. You learn
but in
lessons.
the economic area, we didn't.
And it allows scholars to say, you were wrong on this one, here's why, and then you adapt.
And you learn.
You learn. And so we still don't have that today, by the way, because that was one thing that was eliminated from our Chips and Science Act.
Yeah. It should just be best practices.
It should be best practice.
It shouldn't be something you have to legislate. Fortunately, sometimes you got to, but...
So to the latter point, how's Chips and Science implementation going? That, too, should be sort of the subject of these reports. It's going well. Listen, I brag about the fact that our tech hubs are being designated, a very high level of participation across the country for the Tech Hubs program. I brag about the Microelectronics Commons program at DOD and implementation of Chips and Science itself, where it's unlocked so far $300 billion of capital. We're looking at 40 to 50,000 jobs being created. Most don't require a college education. All those things are positive, but we're learning things too.
Yeah.
We're learning what I think you and I already intuited, which is it would be very difficult to plan even a narrow portion of our economy. This is why we don't plan things that aren't absolutely necessary, right? We don't plan in areas where our counterparties and competitors aren't already planning, requiring us to respond to their subsidies, right? And so going very well. Can this be applied, or should it be applied to other areas? I think we have to be very careful.
Yeah. So,
So I'm not eager to embrace industrial policy in all kinds of sectors. This is a rare case. It's a mission-critical component, and I don't want to increase the cost to our military or to our consumers by reshoring too many things.
Yeah. You know, from my perspective, in terms of being a global CEO, here's the way I look at it. Let's make pretend you're the CEO, I'm China. I can steal your intellectual property. I don't have to be reciprocal.
Yes.
I can use slave labor for $30 a month. I can use those big coal-fired power plants in Xinjiang with cheap energy. I don't have to obey the law.
You can subsidize production.
I have the law. Get subsidized. I don't have to be audited. I can cook the books. I can make the quarter. I don't have to be huddled under the desk, under the fetal position, although in China, I'm sure they are. I'm going to win every time. And so, one of the things I said is, we're for traders. We believe in the free market, but somebody comes in, doesn't play by the rules. The market's no longer free. It's a fool's market, and you got to do something about it.
Yes.
And so I call that strategy. And
it's a hard argument to make.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with typically like-minded people who have subscribed to free market policies and marinated in Frederick von Hayek and Milton Friedman, and then you're telling them, no, there are times when government action is actually required. So it took leadership.
Yeah. Here's an interesting industry, the solar business. Here's the good news, that industry experts say by 2050, 50% of our energy will be solar. This is going to have a great impact on the environment. The bad news is that China owns about 95% of the solar panel business. Of course, it's made in Xinjiang. Why? It's extremely energy intensive.
Yes.
The amount of energy a solar panel puts out in 3 years is equivalent to the energy you need to make it. And here again, they're doing that with slave labor over there. And we know that energy security is national security. Wars are begun and they're lost because of energy.
Yes.
So this is a national security issue. And it was interesting because my official title was Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. And so one of the things I said in my confirmation hearing when I was asked about environment and energy, I said, I'm an engineer, so I look at it as an optimization equation. And that is, you have an objective function that is one, which is your goal. And then you have the knobs. So it's optimize economic growth, energy security, and the health of the planet to maximize national security. Because all those things make up national security. That's kind of the dial. But that's one that is scary. That's the one that scares me the most.
Me as well. And as we think about energy security and some of the work that you and the Krach Institute have been attentive to, the Inflation Reduction Act, most specifically, not the litany of different provisions that are unrelated to subsidies for electrification, but as it relates to the climate or electrification subsidies. Climate is a very important issue. There are thoughtful ways to address this. The most efficient, thoughtful way would be through a taxation of carbon. Politically, that is a non-starter for a number of reasons. So, absent that, I've always believed that a massive investment in research, so we can innovate our way out of this, would be the best approach. We did not take that approach. We didn't look at the upstream investments in research to address it. Instead, we're basically great leap forward for electrification. And I don't think there's probably not a way back right now. But I see it as ironic that on one hand, we made our supply chains more resilient through chips and science. Right? That's what we're doing.
Yeah,
we're taking some of the risk. We're still going to be dependent on other countries for components and so forth, but we're taking some of the risk out of those supply chains. At the same time, we've made ourselves far more dependent on other countries for critical minerals. Mm-hmm. Does that seem incongruous to anyone other than me? I think it does. Like, the former chairman of Toyota, who didn't think it would make sense to go along with this strategy because there wasn't consumer demand for all the electric vehicles. Looks like they too are having to adopt to this new normal on account of public policy incentives. But I think it's important. The reason I say that it's not a gotcha, it's not an I told you so, certainly not a partisan comment. But I say that because we need to document these things.
Yeah.
If we begin sloppy thinking about industrial policies, you can do the wrong things.
Yeah. You know, when you go back in the supply chain on chips and solar, it's made of polysilicon, which is really not a critical mineral. It's sand. But here again, that's an energy-intensive process. That's done in Xinjiang. China owns 90% of that business too. And for the polysilicon business, 90% of the polysilicon goes to solar, 10% goes to semiconductors. So what we would call in a business world, we call that a pinch point.
Yes.
I mean, that is really a risk. That was one of the things we really need to focus on in this country. We really pointed that out. And it's just like, yeah, and it's really not that complicated. But it just takes willpower to do it. And I know you guys are doing so much in Congress. And it's the biggest unifying bipartisan issue is this China issue.
It unifies us across party lines.
Yeah.
It unifies the heartland with the coast, and it realigns kind of the incentives as it relates to next-gen technologies, makes everyone feel like they're playing a part. So it's great on that. It actually unifies our alliance system, our friends and partners around the world. In fact, we injected through the CHIPS and Science Act a modest amount of money, as you know, in the State Department, and that was heavily oversubscribed. Think of it as sort of global, non-China project-based learning, project-based sort of team development, trying to coordinate supply chains and
really
vulnerabilities and co-production and R&D, and it's
because
it's
so
been
much
great.
of this
setting
game,
the parameters too.
Well, so much of this game is economies of scale.
Yeah.
So we need our allies. You know, a lot of these folks are from the private sector. One of the comments got made at our advisory council committee meeting.
The lights are pretty bright, by the way. Like, I don't even know I can't see anyone. But
it's hard to see.
Thank you for being here.
But I want to tell you, Todd, you look really good. Okay.
Thank you.
Butter up your senator, I always say. But anyway, that's funny. Where was I going? Oh, a lot of these folks are from the private sector. So it was probably about a year ago, I penned an article in Fortune magazine that said, present your China contingency plan at the next board meeting. It was based upon, you know, all these companies having to be pulled out of Russia, lost hundreds of billions of dollars. You know, if that happens, war breaks out, or even if Xi's just clamping down, it's 30x that. And, you know, board members' fiduciary duty to their shareholders is to mitigate risk. You have a plan on the shelf, you know, for a cybersecurity breach, but most of these guys don't have a China contingency plan. And this is like, you can't stick your head on the sand on that. And we've talked about, tell us some of the things that you can do to bring this to life. I know you wrote a letter to the SEC chairman. You've even talked about legislating that these kind of things need to be disclosed, particularly forced labor and supply chain. Tell us about your work you're doing, because we really need your support to drive, because this is a really all society effort.
We really do. And you, credit Keith. Keith helped put this concept of a China contingency plan, a CCP, on my radar screen, which is the idea, if we're going to require, either through government regulation or through third-party requirements, index fund requirements or something, that you have to be ESG compliant. Surely the risk associated with investments in China ought to also be disclosed, and the risk ought to be disclosed to your investors. And so I think the appropriate place to deal with this would be at the SEC. I don't really know Commissioner Gensler well. We sent him a thoughtful letter.
You did?
And
you made it public,
that letter is public, available online, asking a series of detailed and pointed questions, ones that, frankly, should not have been all that difficult to answer. And I understand they're busy, but they slow-walked it for a number of months. And then we got the most bureaucratic, throwaway response you might expect to a national security issue. So at least this chairman is not taking it particularly seriously. So we are trying to find some other vectors to address it. In the meantime, as Reagan was fond of saying, if you can't make them see the light, make them feel the heat, and I'll continue to bring this up.
One of the triangulation things is on this whole area of pension funds and these Chinese companies and the index funds and invest is the Secretary of Labor, because the Secretary of Labor has 2/3 the authorities for ERISA, and they have a fiduciary duty to the pension fund managers to issue business advisories. Have you thought about that in terms of that would make a dramatic difference? It made a difference when we put out a business advisory on forced labor, and then I sent a letter to all the CEOs of the United States and all the board of trustees and board of governors for
This
universities.
is thought leadership in action. So I had not thought about that. So why don't I'll just adapt that letter and we'll send it to labor and get that conversation moving. So
I got a letter written for you.
That'd be great. No, I mean, listen, we're looking for opportunities. When you have, as it relates to the Gensler interaction, when you have American companies located in the People's Republic and they're harvesting data from the company, there's an always a looming risk of stealing plant property or equipment, seizing it when they want. They just don't operate by the same standards of due process and business rights that we do. So, that of course impacts your shareholders, and that needs to be disclosed.
Yeah. Our time's running short. I want to just say how much I appreciate you being on the advisory council for the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue, and also being an honorary co-chair for the Global Tech Security Commission.
You're welcome.
Whose charter is to develop a global tech security strategy. This is a unique commission. We've got about 40 commissioners. A lot of them are international, former prime ministers, great tech commissioners, strategists. We've got 130 advisory council folks on that. So my last two questions to you. What would you like to see in that? Because really, if you look at, we have offense, defense, and force multiplier. It pretty much mirrors at least the pillars for the global economic security strategy. A lot of overlap. And then also big initiative out of that is the global trusted tech network, which is like the clean network on steroids. What would you like to see about that? And then my final question to you is, why is the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue the greatest, or what?
Well, we'll just sort of begin with the last one. It is the greatest. So, and I can circle back to that one more if you like. But listen, what would I like the Institute in various ways, whether it's through the Global Commission or other capacities, to continue addressing? I know that the Institute has focused to some degree on synthetic biology, this ability to manipulate living, DNA and create new materials, new life forms. And this will have just uncapped potential to improve our lives in various ways, allow us to live longer, healthier, safer, but also will create new national security vulnerabilities for our country. This is getting a lot less attention because I'm not aware that there has yet been a ChatGPT analog within the life sciences space, but this is the top research priority, has been for a number of years, running of our intelligence community for a reason. So to the extent you can continue to show leadership in that area for policymakers, that would be very helpful.
It's really important.
There are a lot of vulnerabilities we have.
Yes.
In fact, Mustafa Suleyman, some have been reading his book, very great read. He talks about two foundational technologies for the 21st century. One is artificial intelligence, the other is synthetic biology. The other thing is, I would say as we wrestle with artificial intelligence, I just came from yet another AI Insight Forum today, where we brought in some of the world's best minds on artificial intelligence. Myself, Chuck Schumer, Mike Rounds, and Martin Heinrich were the four bipartisan senators that have been working on this. We aim to legislate, but we want to modulate our efforts, appropriately. We don't want to kill the golden goose. We want the United States of America to continue to lead the way, but we have to manage some of these risks that are often put forward. So to the extent you can find a role there, maybe international, in integrating, get out in front of the global effort, where we're trying to stitch together similar, but with some difference, domestic statutes for non-Chinese countries. If we can harmonize our domestic laws on AI regulation, then we set the rules of the road, informed by our values, the values of the Declaration of Independence, the universal values that this country is founded on, that most of the world subscribes to, not the values of the Chinese Communist Party. Game, set, and match if we do that, because if they want to get scale and sell into the rest of the world in China, they're going to have to subscribe to our values on privacy, on bias, and so many other areas. So that's another opportunity.
By the way, that's a great point. It's interesting because Harvard Business School did a case study on a clean network. And I got to sit in on that. And they had about 5 Chinese students in there. And the professor asked, so, if you're the Chinese government, what are you going to do? And he said this. He said, the clean network is a catch-22 for China, because it represents close to 70% of the world's global GDP. And the tenets of the clean network are that any country can join the clean network. They just have to live by the trust doctrine, this doctrine we came up with. They have to pledge, and their behavior has to do it. And if they don't change their laws, like their National Intelligence Act, and their behavior, then they're excluded. If they do, they're in. And so it's and the beauty of that strategy is that we don't do the domination doctrine of retribution, retaliation.
It's a new rules-based order. It's a rules-based tech order.
It is.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I think your point is just, it's just so right on that. Well, I got to thank you for everything you're doing as a great bipartisan senator. What you've done to support the technology business, what you're doing to support the Institute, the Commission, and God bless you, man.
Well, thanks for what you're doing, taking your life of professional experience in technology, in business, and growing organizations, in leadership, in government. This is an amazing contribution, so
well,
I appreciate
that.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Yeah.